Podcast. This is episode 749, and we are here live in Southwest Florida in my studio this morning. Oh, did this fall down? I lifted it up. I guess I didn't tighten the screw tight enough. Well, we'll lift it up in a couple minutes. If you're joining me live, please say hello. If you have questions for me, please let me know. If you are crafting, I know not only me, I would love to hear about it, but I'm sure everybody else here would love to hear what you're working on as well. So I will wait for people to pop over from pre-chat and notifications. Hi Tricia, good morning. Grace and Val, good morning. Happy Tuesday. Hi Donna and Thea, Judy, Joe, good morning. Hi Kimberly, Mariana, Donna, good morning. Welcome back to Create, Share, Inspire podcast. This is episode, what did we say, 749? Wow, 749. Hi Lisa, Angela, Kiranjit, Barbara, Migdalia, Rita, Lisa, Geraldine. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Create, Share, Inspire podcast. This is episode 749. I'm Kristin Omdahl, and we're here live in Southwest Florida in my studio this morning. I have some announcements to share with you. Hi, Geraldine and Kathy. Well, the comments seem to be moving regular speed today. That's nice. Hi, Carla. Good morning. Okay, well, my first announcement is to share with you that I have officially finished all 24 patterns, charts, and samples for the new crochet book. Everything has gone to tech editing at some level. I know a lot of it has gone through the first round of tech editing, so I will then do the re-edit from there. Hi Naomi and Joyce, Judy, Barbara, Angela, Carrie, Wendy. So that was very exciting. So last night I started working on the front matter and the back matter in the book because I was a little too fried to work on tech editing. But very, very, very exciting. I did register the title with ISBN numbers, which is with the Library of Congress, I believe. So it's official. We have an ISBN number, which is very exciting. And so now what that means is that is the book's unique code, kind of like us having a social security number. It is the book's unique code. It'll go on the barcode on the back of the book, and that's how the book gets registered with the Library of Congress and how it gets cataloged in any place that you purchase books. So whether you purchase on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or even at the library, the ISBN number is the unique number of the book. So getting that done officially last night was cool, which means I had to come up with the official title to do that. So all of that was done. One thing that I really enjoyed working on last night was, it's not called a bibliography. I can't think of what it's called, but at the back of a book when you say other titles by this author, I had to, let's see if I can pull it up. I think I can pull it up here. I had so much fun making this page because I couldn't believe how many books are in my body of work. So here is that page. Can you see it on the screen? If I can bring it close enough. Those are all of my titles, and I haven't done this in a couple of books, so it needed to be updated anyway. So I had so much fun doing that, and I did write this new title as a 2021 title. I do believe it's going to get published in 2021, not 2020, because what is the date today? The 15th? Yeah, I'm going to say that this is going to be a January 2021 title. So the first title for 2021 is written on there. So that was really fun to write out that whole list. I don't know, it's kind of cool. So it was from 2008 to 2021. Anyway, it was really fun. So I worked on that, and then, there is a section that I want to work on for the front matter in the book, and I thought that if I did it as sort of an instructional tutorial here this morning, I could start, fleshing out my ideas, and you can get some of the benefit of me talking about this content a little early as well. But there's some really interesting things to consider when, especially, so this book is going to have the patterns sized. So it's not only hats, but the hats are going to be sized. And there's a couple of really great reasons for that. And there's some drawbacks to how they get sized. So I need to go in two directions. Which one do I take first? Okay, so when sizing the hats, it isn't always necessarily 16, 18, 20, 22, 24-inch circumference. It's based on the stitch patterns, right? So when you use a variety of stitch patterns, sometimes those stitch patterns have large repeats, like let's say 18 stitches in a repeat, and sometimes it's a 3 or 4 stitch repeat. And so depending on the size of the repeat, and this applies to all sorts of pattern design, not just with hats, any type of a project, when your stitch pattern is in a different multiple, sometimes you have to make your sizing based on that multiple. So let's say you have a large repeat, let's say 18 or 20 stitches to a repeat, and it's 3 or 4 stitches wide per repeat. Well, then you can't make your sizing any closer than that. Would have to be in increments of your stitch pattern unless you're going to modify your stitch pattern in any way. Does that make sense? Before I go further, I want to make sure everybody understands that, because that's a really big part of what I'm about to talk about. So if your stitch pattern has a big repeat, let's say it's 4 inches per repeat, you can't change your sizes by any less than a 4-inch increment. Does that make sense? So like, for example, let's say you're using a larger stitch pattern and it's a 4-inch repeat, and your original, let's say we're doing a hat, and your original size is 20 inches, right? You have a 20-inch circumference. Well, if you're going to remove one repeat, that bumps you all the way down to 16 inches, and if you're going to add a repeat, that bumps you all the way up to 24 inches. So on a hat like that, your sizes would only be 16, 20, and 24 inches. Well, that's a little bit limiting. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is that you actually have more options at this point. And the options that I'm going to share with you that you have at this point also allow you to not only change the size, but maybe even work on the same patterns in a different yarn weight and use the elements that I'm going to share with you for other types of modifications. So before we get started on that, let's talk about the anatomy of a hat to begin with. So we've got very basic. Obviously, there are all sorts of hats and they're designed in all sorts of ways, but we're going to talk about this tutorial from the aspect of a top-down, where you start small, make a circle for the crown and increasing out for the circle crown, and then work even for the hat walls to create the walls of the hat. So assuming that that's what we're doing, we start with a circle, and then once we have that circle for the crown, we work down, so it's increasing out from here to there, and you increase in every round. And then from here you work even down to the bottom of the hat. And how you determine sizing, like if you're going to do this even without a pattern, how you determine sizing is you want to, so once you know, so as you're making this circle, and I'm going to pull up my, okay, so as you're making this circle, to determine what size hat you want, depending on how wide this is. So this number here, that's your radius, but if you took a measurement from here to here, that's your diameter. And so your diameter times pi, which is 3.14 rounded down, equals the circumference of your hat. Okay, what's the circumference of your hat? The circumference of your hat is how wide it needs to be to go around your head. And you can back engineer this as well. If you know the circumference, let's say you know you need to make a hat for somebody for ths divided by 3.14 will give you the diameter of your circle crown. Okay, so either way whichever way you have the information and you need whichever piece you want, you can figure out the other piece with pi. So if you know the diameter, you multiply by pi, you get the circumference, which is this number here, which goes around all of that. If you know the circumference, aka the hat size or the head size you need to fit, and you divide by 3.14 or pi, you get the diameter of the circle crown. So let's say you know you want to make a 22-inch hat. If you know you want to make a 22-inch hat, you need this number to be 7 inches. So let's say you know you want a 22-inch hat, so you divide it by 3.14 and you get 7 inches. This applies to centimeters too, so if you were doing this in metric, same thing applies. Pi is pi, 3.14 regardless. I know it's geometry, but it's very simple geometry, and it allows you to make custom size hats. And I am going somewhere much simpler once we get through this part, I promise. So let's say you're just making your circle. You would want to stop making your circle when it ends up being 7 inches across. When it's 7 inches across, you are having a hat that's 22 inches. Okay, so that's one way to customize a hat. One of the other ways would be to base, let's say the hat is done in Be So Baby yarn and you want to do the same hat in a thicker yarn, or you want to double the yarn. That's a good example. Let's say you want to make it much thicker, so you're going to double Be So Baby yarn, and so instead of working it on a G hook, you're going to bump it up to a K hook. You would want to take your you would want to take your gauge swatch and figure out how many stitches to the inch you're getting, right, for your gauge, and then that gauge multiplied by your circumference would equal the stitch count that you would need for that. Okay, so let me do some quick math here. So let's say, just for even numbers, let's say the original hat had 100 stitches for the circumference for working all the way around here. Once you finished your circle, then you needed to get to 100 stitches, let's say, to get a 22-inch hat, which would give you 7 inches. So let's say it took 100 stitches to get all the way around that final round before you started working even. Okay, and that 100 stitches, we're gonna have to round this to a 20-inch hat to make this easy. So 100 stitches divided by 5 stitches to the inch equals a 20-inch hat, okay? We're gonna make this nice and even math. So that's based on 5 stitches to the inch. Let's assume that this is 5 stitches to the inch, single with a size G hook, whatever. And you want to do it in a different gauge. So let's say we're bumping it up to, let's say we're bumping it up to 4 stitches to the inch, or 3 stitches to the inch. So 100 divided by 4 stitches to the inch equals, would still equal a 20-inch hat. No, what am I doing? No, I did this wrong. Hold on. See, this is what I said. I'm trying to flesh this out for doing okay, so it would not, no. So let's say you have that 20-inch hat still, times 4 stitches to the inch, then you would only need 80 stitches instead of 100 stitches based on that. So if you still needed a 20-inch hat and you now got 3 stitches to the inch, you'd only need 60 stitches. Okay, so here's where it's going to get super easy now. Let's say that this hat was sized as well, and so this hat sizes, so one of the smaller sized hats has 80 stitches or 60 stitches. Somebody's here. Oh, a delivery truck. So let's say one of the smaller sizes at the larger gauge was for a smaller hat. Well, now that you have a bigger gauge, I said that wrong again too. Okay, so with the thinner yarn it took more stitches to get an inch, right? So at 5 stitches to the inch, it took 100 stitches to equal a 20-inch hat. At 4 stitches to the inch, it takes 80 stitches to get to a 20-inch hat. And at 3 stitches to the inch, it takes 60 stitches to get a 20-inch hat. But if that pattern was written at 5 stitches to the inch with multiple sizes, you could then so knowing that you need 80 stitches to get the circumference at the 4 stitches to the inch, if you then go back and look at that pattern and look through some of the smaller sizes at 5 stitches to the inch, you could choose one of the smaller sizes to get this number and end up making the bigger hat. That's a big deal. So I know that I went a long way around in saying it, so I'm going to pause now to make sure that everybody understands that, because it really is a very convenient way to manipulate a pattern to make it work for something other than what's written. So if your gauge changes because you're trying to add a different element to the pattern, you can use the wrong size based on a new gauge and make the same hat. And I will pause because that's a lot of information. Let's see if anybody has questions, or if that clicks. Rita, this is only for people that want to modify patterns. If you're happy just following patterns as they're written, there is no math required at all. That's the beauty of following a pattern. So when you follow any of my patterns as written with the same yarn, with the same gauge, you don't have to do any math. But not unfortunately, but sometimes people like to change things up, and that's where you get into some really tricky situations if you don't understand how to manipulate a pattern once you've changed a different component. Okay, that's fine. A lot of you are happy just following patterns. That's great. But a lot of times people want to use a different yarn, or they want to make a yarn, or they want to double up a yarn for a quicker project. There's all sorts of reasons why people like to modify patterns. That's okay if you're scared to change things up, because there is a lot of math involved, and if that's intimidating to you, it's, you have the patterns written exactly as is, and there's nothing wrong with following patterns as they're written. Keeps me in business. That's okay. It's okay if you're scared to change things up. That's totally fine. Okay, another thing that I wanted to mention is that gauge can change between working rows and rounds. So let's say that you try a stitch pattern for a project and you're doing your gauge swatch flat in rows, but the pattern is ultimately going to be worked in the round. It is possible that your gauge could be off for that as well. So when a pattern is written in the round, it is a good idea to do your gauge swatch in the round too. Yes, Geraldine, this applies to sweaters as well. It applies to anything, actually. If your gauge is significantly different than the pattern states, you can manipulate by choosing a different size also. So Geraldine was saying she, can I do an example using Be So Baby yarn? Probably don't have time to do that right this morning, Donna, but I can. Oh, good. Sandshell finds this interesting. So Geraldine was saying that her gauge was so large, so much larger than what the pattern called for, that she ended up making a smaller size in the sweater. Geraldine, question for you. Did it work? Oh, it totally worked, she said. Okay, good. Does anybody have more questions? Because I'd like to move on and talk about other components of it, but I think that there's enough here that we should make sure someone doesn't. Yes, I'm hoping to put this as some of the content in the front section of my next book. Definitely. I think it's a very, especially since it's a hat book that has multiple sizes, I feel like you have a lot of options for doing this. Some of the hats even have 5 sizes, so I mean, there's an incredibly inclusive size range in this hat book. Yeah, Proverbs switches up her yarn for what's called for in a pattern all the time. Then this is definitely information that can be helpful for you, because sometimes it is impossible to get the same gauge as the original yarn in a different yarn. It could be a different thickness altogether, right? So if you're wanting to not only switch yarns but switch thicknesses of yarns too, this is really, really helpful information. I mean, definitely going off grid a little bit, but it does work if you can follow the math, which it's not super difficult math, but I know it can be intimidating. But if you can follow the math, you can definitely change the size of something. I mean, you could even end up making the newborn size, but with a different gauge, and it'll turn out to be an adult large. It's amazing. Oh, that's okay, Proverbs. I know my name comes with lots of variations. I knew what you meant. I read typo. Yes, if you started with a pattern in a thicker yarn and you wanted to make it in a much thinner yarn, the same thing applies. So no matter which way you want to go with a pattern, that applies. So you would, and then it depends on how far you're trying to go, right? Because sometimes that'll take you off. Okay, so let's say the pattern has 5 sizes, right? So let's say we have a small, medium, large, XL, and XXL. And let's say that you want to make the large and you're adjusting the gauge. And so let's say you're going to use a thicker yarn and it's going to be a much bigger gauge. So you would end up going down in size to make the small. Let's say you're wanting to make the large and you're going to go into a thinner yarn that's going to need a much bigger gauge. You would need to go up in size to get more stitches in order to still make the large. So you can go in both directions easily if you're in the middle, going up or down. Where it gets tricky is, let's say you want to make the XXL and you're going to go down in thinner yarn, which means you're going to need more stitches. Then you wouldn't be able to pick a different size within the pattern. Then you would actually have to do a little more math at that point. And you could still do it with some minimal math. Let's say whatever the repeat is for the pattern, let's say it's 3 stitches per repeat, or 2 stitches per repeat, something like that. You would need to then bump up the number of repeats to get all the way around, which means you might need to do extra rounds in the crown in order to get to the number of stitches you need for the circumference. So that's actually a more technical type of modification, but still totally doable. And that's something you can do if a pattern only comes in one size too. You could manipulate that way as well, whether you're even staying in the same yarn or changing your gauge. So it applies to that as well. Thank you, Proverbs. Thank you, Tricia. Carla has also done a sweater using a smaller size with a thicker yarn, so it has worked for her too. Great. Yeah, I have done the same thing. Not so much with following patterns, but like sometimes when I design before I write the pattern. I've talked about this many times before, where I just sit down and start working on something. And so if I'm doing a top-down raglan top, and let's say in Be So Sporty yarn, I know I need 20 foundation ovals to start the neckline before starting my increases. If I'm going to use a thicker yarn and a bigger hook, I'll start with less than 20 foundation ovals in the beginning. And if I'm going to bump down to Be So Fine yarn, and use a thinner hook, I'm going to need more than 20 foundation ovals most likely. So even just as those are just common things that you're going to need to do more or less if you're going to change the yarn thickness and the appropriate sized larger or smaller crochet hook for doing that. And this applies to knitting too. All of this is for knitting or crochet. Carla is working on a hat now that should have gone to the smaller size because it looks huge, but she'll give it to someone with a lot of hair. Perfect. That's the other thing. Hats don't take that long to make. So even if you're learning a new technique and it doesn't turn out the right size, give it away, donate it, and consider it part of the journey of learning. We often learn the most through our mistakes, right? So with a small project like a hat, no reason to unravel it. Give it away or gift it and move on with the knowledge that you gain from it. That's great. Does anybody have any other questions or want me to go over any of this with more detail? Hi, Donna. Good morning. Yeah, hats are the perfect gift, right? Proverb, you made 500 hats for Hat Not Hate. That's incredible. That's great. Christine, why do I use foundation ovals instead of plain stitches? There's nothing wrong with plain chains. If you like to use just a regular crochet chain for starting something, there is nothing wrong with that. And I have been, and I've used them before and I still use them occasionally. I prefer foundation ovals for a couple of reasons. I think they're easier to work into than a beginning chain, and depending on where they are in a project, beginning chains can be very rigid and not have any elasticity to them. So anytime you can use a foundation stitch of any kind, it gives you a little more flexibility. So, and when I say foundation stitch of any kind, I mean foundation single crochet, foundation half double crochet, foundation double crochet, and onwards and upwards with the taller stitches, or foundation ovals. Either way, okay, yeah, and the other thing is, Kimberly, they do give a cute scalloped edge, absolutely. But they're easier to work into as well, just like with granny stitch. That granny stitch where you're working into the holes between stitches is much easier to see than working into a stitch, which is great for textured yarn, great for low lighting, or great for somebody who's straining to see. There's lots of reasons why it can be just more convenient to work into a larger hole than work into an actual small stitch. Especially as a beginner, when you're not familiar with the anatomy of the stitches and you're not sure where to insert your hook, those holes end up being very easy for beginners to learn too. Let's see. You're welcome, Carla. And so then the other beauty of foundation ovals, where there's two other things. When you're doing something, we've done this on shawls before. Am I going to have any room down here? So if you're doing a rectangular shawl where you do foundation ovals instead of chains in the middle to then work out in each direction for a rectangle, couple of benefits here. Those foundation ovals actually end up being invisible compared to what a starting chain would look like. They end up being more invisible within a lot of lacy or stitch patterns, and that way you can get a mirrored view on both edges of the shawl, and you end up being able to replicate the edging really well on there. So if you did a starting chain in here, it could pucker it, and here's another benefit of it. If you're doing a rectangular shawl and you're not going to work from the center out, and you're just going to work in one direction, right or left or top, this would work for top to bottom or side to side. If you started with a chain here instead of foundation ovals, this side will most likely be narrower than this side, and it will not be symmetrical, and I don't like that at all. So that's another really great benefit for using foundation ovals instead of chains. Yeah, we're out of time, but yes, I could talk about converting chains to foundation ovals, because it's actually simpler than you might think. You would just want to represent however many stitches you need for the stitch pattern, but I could do that with some samples. I could do that with some samples another day, because that's a whole other subject, and it would take probably a lot of this to do that too. Yep, like the Sunny Isle shawl, exactly. That's what this. yeah, it's not difficult to do, and because we do foundation ovals in different heights, so we do a chain 3 double crochet. We sometimes we do a chain 4 double crochet. Sometimes we do a chain 4 treble, chain 5 treble, and then we do a chain 5 double treble. And each one of those are respectively larger, and they're for covering a different number of stitches or for replacing a different multiple of chains. Thank you, Carla. I am wearing the Mandy pullover. This is a knit pattern in my knitting shop. Thank you, Judy. Judy just shared this one. I forgot to mention that one this morning. This is the tailor hat from Be So Caring book in Be So Baby Yarn, and this is the Mandy pullover. That's crochet. This is knit, and this is the Mandy pullover in Be So Sporty Yarn. You can find that as a instant pattern download on my website. You can also find Be So Sporty Yarn there, and what else? Oh, and there's a video tutorial for this one already available on YouTube, and I will be doing a video tutorial hopefully later today for the tailor hat. Thank you, Salsa. Hi, Genevieve. Thanks for joining. We did a very meaty podcast today, and so if you're just joining now, I highly recommend that you come back and watch the recorded version as well, because there's a lot of really wonderful information about not only hats and how to tweak a pattern if you're changing yarn or you're changing your gauge, but also ways that you can apply this to other types of projects as well. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks for all the links, Judy. I appreciate it. All right, and thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend a few minutes here with me. I hope you enjoyed our little tutorial, some of our show and tell, chatting with me and everyone else. Thanks for all of the great questions today. Your questions allow me to not only answer you live, but really just make the whole conversation just so much more full-bodied. So I appreciate all of you very much. Hope you enjoyed chatting with me and everyone else. Let us make time to create, share, and inspire today and every day. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place.